Welcome to the Slavic Connection. I'm here with Dr. Mark Pomar. Dr. Mark Pomar is joining us from the Clement Center at the University of Texas. I'll give you a little background. You know your own background, but I'll let the audience know as well. Started out at Tufts University in Boston, graduated with a PhD from Columbia, then made your way as a lecturer in Vermont, went across the pond, working at Radio Free Europe, a couple of foundations afterwards, dealing with public policy, civics, economics, and now you find yourself at the U.S., well, you find yourself at the University of Texas, but formerly at the U.S.-Russia Foundation. How many mistakes have I made so far?
You've done pretty well. The only thing I would add is that from 82 or from 83 to 93, I was a federal employee. So I worked in the U.S. government, Voice of America, and then I headed something called Board for International Broadcasting, which was the oversight agency that oversaw all of broadcasting.
Excellent. Well, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. So hoping to touch on a number of topics. First question, actually, virtue of Matt Orr, who you spoke with yesterday, is actually about Radio Free Europe. So you were gone by the time the USSR fell. We were wondering sort of what was the ideological bent of Radio Free Europe. They sort of accomplished their entire mission, or maybe their mission was accomplished passively. What was sort of the ideological bend of the organization following the collapse?
Well, let's say, what was its mission before the collapse? Sure. Maybe it would be good to, it was conceived as a surrogate radio station, meaning the idea behind it was very different from Voice of America or BBC, which were the voices of a particular country, a particular culture. The idea behind Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty was that they would be the free voice of the people to whom they were broadcasting.
Right.
So in a sense, you had a Polish service, which was Polish radio as if it were in Warsaw, but it happened to be physically in Munich.
Gotcha.
Or the Czech Republic or Hungary or Russia. So in that sense, the mission obviously was completed and many of the services closed. Polish, the countries that entered NATO, obviously they closed those services. There's no Radio Free Poland, there's no Radio Free Czech Republic. As a matter of fact, the radios moved from Munich to Prague because Václav Havel presented that for free as a gift to the radios for making the Czech Republic free. And it was no cost, the best place in town. We honor you and we want you. The president of Estonia, Leonard Meri, in 92, Estonian service closed, nominated Radio Free Europe for the Nobel Peace Prize. So there was a sense of tremendous triumph that this had come to a happier end than people expected. In the case of Radio Liberty, things were a little bit trickier, but we celebrated the 40th anniversary of Radio Liberty in Moscow in March of 1993, with Gorbachev attending, with one of Yeltsin's senior people attending, with the who's who of the Russian intellectual cultural elite coming. Very famous bard, Bulat Akudzhava, not only came, not only sang, but composed a song in honor of Radio Liberty on the occasion of its 40th anniversary. So that was triumphant. From a personal point of view, I left shortly thereafter and went on to do other things. The idea behind maintaining Radio Liberty was that radio in Russia at that time, they were trying to build up independent radio stations. And Radio Liberty, in a sense, during the 90s, served as a feeder. They couldn't afford to do news. They couldn't afford to have correspondence. So in a sense, Radio Liberty was kind of a crutch that they could rely on and could, for free, get the news at, on the hour for 5 minutes, or some other segments, or something about the United States, or something about Europe, which they could not afford. And the idea was that as Russian media would develop, strengthen, have commercial and non-commercial, that the radios would fade. In other words, it was on a... Now, of course, politically things changed and those radio stations never made it, that many of them were closed. And so Radio Liberty finds itself now only doing television, only doing a few hours a day, and out of Prague. And the idea being that because you now have state-controlled media in Russia, there is a need and interest in an alternative voice.
Right. And do you see sort of the current state of Russian media developing out of that vacuum, or do you think it was sort of inevitable from the depths that they had to come out of, that sort of state-controlled media was the only way to get a hold of sort of a runaway civics nightmare?
Well, there was in the 90s some really good private TV and radio stations and newspapers and outlying areas of Russia. Some of them still struggle to exist, very small scale. At the U.S.-Russia Foundation, we actually gave a grant to one of the few independent TV stations, I think in Yekaterinburg, if I'm not mistaken, to do a series of programs on economics issues and so forth. But for the most part that's gone, and you are back to what you had in the Soviet Union, which is Channel 1 and Russia TV, and then a few others. And basically you have control over that.
Gotcha. And so I know your foundation is not built to upset the state-controlled media in Russia directly. Walk us through sort of how you're communicating with the youth, what the kind of your engagement with small businesses is, and kind of the...
Well, if you want me to say a few words about the U.S.-Russia Foundation, it has many different phases, but really to understand it, one has to go back a bit in history. At the very end of the Bush senior administration, the very beginning of the Clinton administration, there was a very innovative program that was approved by Congress that created enterprise funds, real money, to invest in the economies of the former East Bloc, with the idea that through investment in small and medium-sized business, you could do training and you would jumpstart the private sector economy. So there was a Polish fund, there was a Czech fund, there was a Hungarian, Albanian, Bulgarian, Russian, Ukrainian, and on and on and on. They varied in size in terms of the amount of money. Some got 100 million, some got 30 million, some got 15 million, depending a little bit on size of the country and the political pull that they had in terms of getting it. The idea was you would invest, you would earn money. If there was money at the end of the program, you pay back the government. So you pay them back. It's not a freebie. It's a loan, if you want to put it that way. And then the money remaining would be a foundation in perpetuity. That was the idea behind it. A little bit of like the German Marshall Fund, which is the sort of legacy of the Marshall Plan.
Neoliberalism, jumpstart.
So that is the idea behind it. Poland was the first to liquidate its investments and ended up with a $240 million Polish Freedom Foundation in downtown Warsaw.
Gotcha.
Run by Poles, and they have a board of directors, Polish-American, and they do Polish-American programs, Polish programs. The largest, if you can believe it, is the Bulgarian Foundation.
Didn't know that.
With about 480 million. Wow. The Russian Foundation had about 160 million when I was recruited to be its first president. And so we, unlike all the others, we were not necessarily overwhelmingly welcomed. We were tolerated, but we were okay. We started in 2008. And for the first 4 or 5 years, things went very smoothly. We had exchange programs. We did programs for students interested in entrepreneurship. We had a program with judges who were very interested in specific aspects of American jurisprudence, and they would pay for it. The innovation to this program, the real innovation, and this is something I learned from my experience, was that we would do no program unless the Russians contributed money.
And what was the reason behind that?
Buy-in. Yeah. It's their program as well. We wanted 50-50, but we would settle for less.
Yeah, sure.
In one case, we had the Russians contributing more than 50%. They really wanted the program. They knew what they wanted, and we helped facilitate a program by adding a little bit of money that they could not easily charge to their account.
And do you guys have boots on the ground, walking through how to use this fund?
We had an office in Moscow. I lived and worked in Moscow. I had a staff in Moscow. We had a very tiny staff in the States, but we knew through my board and through other contacts, we would be able to set up meetings for them, seminars, workshops, whatever. And that worked worked very well, actually. We got lots of applications. We had students going to Purdue, to UCLA. It's interesting. We had a relationship between St. Petersburg University and UCLA. They competed for this, so we selected them based on their desire to run the program. And the St. Petersburg rector and vice rector came to UCLA, and they just fell in love with the weather. They thought, and they always scheduled meetings in winter.
From St. Petersburg.
Always,
that's not hard
always. Whereas, of course, they invited the UCLA in May, June, the months that were nice there. So that went really well until the demonstrations of 2011 about the Duma elections, and then the demonstrations against Putin in his election in 2012, and then the curtain started coming down. Yes. It came down relatively slowly. It did not come down right away. Right. The clouds gathered and they got darker and darker as we went. But you could tell the mood was that way. The example I use very often in talking about it is that I would have a breakfast meeting with the Minister of Education in, let's say, 2010, 2011. Very happy with our programs. I would attend the meeting of university rectors. They were happy. They competed. They wanted to be part of this program. Sure. Once Putin returned, and he said in a press conference that these American institutions are scurrying around our universities, trying to find our most talented youth, bring them to the U.S., brainwash them. We can't have that. The minute he said that, it's like, that's the end. Our applications went down to virtually to zero. People started being very cautious. If in the past they would come to our office for a meeting, they stopped coming to our office. I had to request to meet them at their office in a special room. And it was the Soviet Union all over again. In other words, you had people who don't introduce themselves, which is immediately suspect, usually security service. And they sit in the back of the room, they take notes. And the poor Russian chinovnik, bureaucrats, terrified to say anything because notes are being taken. God knows what they're going to write there. The mood changed completely.
And you're just trying to give them money. It's not like you're buying state secrets or anything.
I'm sorry?
It's not like you're buying state secrets or anything.
Quite the contrary. Everything we do is totally open, and everything's on our website, and everything is done in cooperation with a Russian institution.
Sure.
I also attended something. This is an interesting point. There was something that started in the 1990s called a council of donors, where initially they were all Western donors, American, German, British. And slowly but surely, Russians started joining. There were oligarch foundations set up. And by the time I came in 2008, we were a member of it. We were kind of an important member because we supported the idea of a donor society.
Right.
That independent, technically independent of the government. And that got closed down as well.
Yeah.
So everything just literally the end. And finally, in 2015, we, along with a lot of other organizations, were put on an undesirable list. And that was the end of our presence. The foundation exists in the U.S. and now gives grants to American organizations.
Sure. And so I'm curious what you have to say about, I think a big failure of the U.S. in at least the post-Soviet period was we were so obsessed with good relations with leaders. Yeltsin and Clinton had this great relationship. I don't think we invested in institutions at all. We kind of just thought if we had diplomatic relations, they would sort of, emerge this liberal order.
Well, let me just take you back to some examples of things I think did work well.
I love going back.
I was president of IREX for a number of years. IREX started as the first American educational scholarly exchange program in the United States. Its roots go back to 1958. Formerly, it's a child of the Ford Foundation. Basically, the Ford Foundation created IREX, and IREX then went on to do things. And we had a number of grants and programs, State Department, USAID programs. Sure. And they were very much directed toward people on the ground. I'll give you one very vivid example, which I think was a superb program. It was called IATP, Internet Access and Training Program. And the idea behind it was that we hired young Americans right out of college, 22-year-olds, 23-year-olds, who would go out to these far outlying areas in Russia that had never seen the internet, had never seen a computer in most cases, certainly not the internet, would connect up, usually in the town library. That was the usual place. It had to be a public access site. It wasn't in the director's office. It wasn't, it was to be used by anyone who so wished. We bought the computers. Sometimes the Soros Foundation would contribute the technical equipment to connected up. And these young Americans speaking basic Russian would live for half a year in these towns, training young Russians to then take over that internet access.
And this is mid-90s, right after the fall.
This would be starting 93, 94, all the way through until it no longer was needed. I mean, by the late 90s, pretty much everyone. But I was at the opening in Kazan of the IATP Center, which was a city holiday. I mean, the mayor came out. I mean, this was big stuff.
Sure.
I was in Chernihiv in Ukraine for the opening of that. And the librarian told me that we had saved the library because of that internet access site. Everyone was coming to the library. Inevitably, someone took books, but they just didn't come.
Right.
And so there were programs like that. They weren't very big, but they were there. There were a lot of programs having to do with training Russians to be economists, to be savvy about the way the world operated. There was the Muskie graduate program. There was the undergraduate program. There was the high school program. I mean, there's a whole series of programs that were directed not at the elite, not at the government, but at the everyday people. They were popular, and they had thousands of applicants. And to this day, a number of people who speak exceptionally good English in Russia came through one of those programs.
Wow. And so do you think, I mean, if the U.S. invested in those in sort of like a Marshall Plan type scope,
well,
do you think
the problem,
that was necessary?
I'll tell you the difference between that. And I was there enough time. The Marshall Plan, remember, was a plan for war-torn Germany that had been defeated, knew that it had been defeated, and where there was a commonality of culture. So in other words, before the rise of Hitler, I mean, Germany, the United States, all the same Western culture, the same Soviet Union was different.
Right.
Russians never considered themselves to be defeated. And this is a mistake that a lot of Americans make. If you push a Russian and say, well, what happened? They would say, we voluntarily decided that the Soviet system was unworkable, untenable, was driving us into the ground, and we stopped the Cold War under Gorbachev. That's their version of what happened.
Okay.
Whether or not that's true, and I think there's a lot of reasons to doubt some of the aspects, but the mentality was not of a defeated nation. Mm-hmm. It was of a nation that was going through a transition from one economic system to another. And so what we could do was limited in many ways by the reaction. As it is, we did a number of things that upset them. I'll give you a very vivid example. For example, the Muskie program. We told the dean and schools, we recruit, we choose, you have no say. That upset them to no end, because in the Russian Soviet tradition, the rector or the dean or the director allows this student or that student to go on a program or not allow them. The idea that a student has the right on his own to apply to an organization and to go was unheard of in Soviet. And I remember the expression on the dean's face when we told them, rather brusquely, maybe unfortunately so, that it's none of your business, it's not your money. It developed a certain resentment as well.
I imagine.
Because we were not going in and we had no real, although there were attempts to do that, and I think they actually redounded to in a negative way, because there was a USAID director who shocked me when he said that, what we really ought to be doing is providing the textbooks for high school. I thought, that is going to go about as positively as Iran producing textbooks for Texas. I mean, it's just not going to work. Mm-hmm. And yet there was this sense on some. So I think our paths were fairly limited.
Yeah.
I mean, we could do what we could do. I'm not talking about the privatization issue. I'm talking about more people to people. But there were attempts to do that. And some of the programs were better. Some of the programs were worse. Peace Corps was popular in some areas, deeply unpopular in Russia. So it was considered an insult.
Any tinge of sort of American paternalism was
considered. Whereas in Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, to this day, it's very popular. Right. They love it. They like it. They're comfortable with it. Mm-hmm. So culturally, I think the Americans, as a general rule, misread the Russians to think that they were like the other people of the Soviet Union or Eastern Europe. And they're not.
Right. Or not, it wasn't Japan post World War II. This wasn't a crushed nation.
And not only that, there's a Russian political culture that is very different from the Polish political culture, Hungarian, Czech, and we misread it. So I think that's kind of where some of the problems were.
And that's kind of the classic question I think that comes up is Russia like this because of Putin, or is Putin like this because of Russia? Would it be a different country if Gaidar was the president for the last 20 years? Or so you think there is they're meeting in the middle, sort of?
Well, they're different. As in any big country, you have different strains.
Right.
Certainly the strain that Putin has chosen is not the one that Medvedev tried to implement and not the one that Gaidar tried to implement. But I would say he probably tapped into the deepest strain. Not the only strain, but the deepest strain. It's easier to motivate people, especially outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg, with a kind of, we are a great nation. You may have nothing in your house, but we're a great nation. People are scared of us. There is imperial nostalgia. This is the last sort of great European empire that kind of fell apart just a few years ago. And there's a lot of disorientation among a lot of people. How is it that we were so powerful and big and important, and all of a sudden we weren't?
Right.
And so he taps into that very, very effectively. Now, another leader could tap into some other strain of Russia. I'm not saying that there aren't others. And the people who don't agree with Putin have tended to leave. So you have millions of people who've left Russia, or you have the kind of dissidents inside the country who do what they need to do to get by, but wouldn't necessarily support, would welcome another strain of Russian. Just like U.S. has different political strains. I mean, most countries have different.
Right.
It's just that Putin very effectively and I think very shrewdly understood that appealing to this core base of imperial, nostalgic, orthodox, mostly rural, small town, gives him a core base that he can rely on.
How do you see that transferring to Russian youth? Because I know there are groups like Nashi and that were sort of...
Well, they're just youth are youth. I mean, there's going to be also diversity there. There's going to be the young person growing up in an international city like Moscow, to a lesser extent St. Petersburg, is going to be fundamentally different from a young person growing up in some small outlying town where they've, have never. We brought one of our programs was entirely focused on bringing people from the regions to this. They had never been to Moscow, they had been to St. Petersburg. And they were smart and they had learned English amazingly well. But they had never seen most of their own country, let alone Europe, let alone the United States. It was just like totally beyond their conception. So that it would depend which youth you're talking about.
Right.
Then there's the youth that travels as well-to-do. Another way of looking at Russian, a Russian economist told me this in shorthand. It's a very shorthand thing. But he said that the Russian extracting economy, selling oil, selling gas, selling timber, diamonds, what have you, essentially can support about 30 million people at the level of a European country. GDP and salary. Problem is Russia has 110 million people outside of that 30 million.
Right.
So if you think of essentially two countries, just roughly speaking, you have the very wealthy and all the people who serve the very wealthy. The drivers, the cooks, the restaurants, the all of that obslužujuще personnel, as Russians say, and the wealthy and the ones who run the companies with very good salaries and the law firms and so forth. You have a mid-sized European country.
Right.
I think the youth in that segment of the Russian population, studies in Europe, studies in the United States.
That's the liberal core.
Well, they don't have to be liberal. They can be very conservative, but they are worldly.
Sure. Cosmopolitan.
But they could be very conservative. It doesn't make them necessarily liberal. But they are different from the 110 million Russia who still have no running water, have outhouses, have to bring water from the village well, have no dirt roads wash out, they can't get from their village to a town. I mean, that Russia is very different. And so you have the most stark inequality probably in the world. One of the starkest inequalities in the world would be in the Russian Federation.
Right. And Moscow's the city of billionaires. And
exactly.
And so how do you see, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
Well, I'm curious, how do you see, I mean, Putin's been so shrewd in kind of displaying Russia as if it is this world economic power. But you look at their per capita GDP, it's maybe right below Portugal, I think.
I would say the best example for anyone in Texas is the GDP of Russian Federation is smaller than the GDP of Texas.
Yeah. What's it about? 2 trillion, 3 trillion or something like that?
Let's start with that very fact. Now,
yeah.
Texas is integrated into the U.S. economy, so there are lots of reasons why. That sort of puts Russia in a certain perspective that I think is very important in terms of how well they play a weak hand. Mm-hmm. You can also then flip that around and say, look how well they play that weak hand.
Right.
They don't have a strong hand. They're not China. They're not producing, and yet they are present in space. They are present certainly in all kinds of nuclear weapons and so forth. They exert political influence. They are, fighting above their class. I mean, right. they're competing with much bigger players, and that takes a certain shrewdness. And that takes a country that has to be by definition authoritarian, because you have to really control your assets very well if you're going to play that game.
Sure.
So the authoritarian model for Russia is a very natural and very historically determined. I saw on today's Facebook, someone posted that
it's a dangerous way to start a sentence.
The law that was recently passed about being against the law to insult the president and the senior members of the government is virtually word for word for the law passed under Nicholas I in 1846. Wow. And the Russians posted both and saying, do you see a difference? And other than a slightly more old-fashioned use of words, the meaning is identical to 1826, 2019. So there is, and Putin has said many times that Nicholas I, Alexander III, the most reactionary czars are his favorites.
Yeah. Until they get their legs blown off. But
anyway, that's kind of what he's tapped into, and I think he's done it very consciously. And I think probably from his point of view, very successfully,
very effectively. And so, I mean, do you see? I mean, everyone always asks, like, what is the next president going to look like? If there's a liberal president post Putin, do we have some European power now where Russia used to be? Or, I mean, it seems like the tenor of this conversation.
I would say if you had seen the movie Death of Stalin,
yes,
chances are, were Putin to die of a heart attack today, you would have a replay of that movie.
No one would touch him for a day.
You would have oligarchs, primarily oligarchs, maneuvering for wealth position, who's going to be on top, not for ideological reasons, but for simply who's going to maintain wealth, who's going to end up in jail. They are really, and as the pie is shrinking, and the Russian economy is not growing, so inevitably that pie is either not getting larger or perhaps even shrinking. The battle at the top becomes nastier.
Yeah.
A growing pie kind of lets everybody sort of get their piece and go quietly. This is going to be so. Putin is many ways a central figure that keeps that balance. I would say there's absolutely no reason to assume someone liberal is going to come along at all. Sooner there will be someone from within that group of inner, mostly former KGB oligarchs, semi-oligarchs. Sechin, is he an oligarch? He used to be in government now? It's a very fluid back and forth. The likelihood one of them would emerge on top. And again, you would have the refiguration of, kind of regaining a balance among the different elements. That's kind of the way it's operated. It's a kleptocratic system. And there's no reason to assume that it would miraculously just change. They're fighting for their own property. The Soviet Union, the ideology died years earlier. It was just a matter of, like a brittle material, it just crumbled. And nobody was there to support it. Nobody really cared about it. This is different. People have real money, real wealth, real position. They want to pass it on to their children. They want to secure that. And so they will fight for it.
It's definitely not who we pretend to work, you pretend to pay us type system any longer.
Money is there, and plenty of money, and they love to spend it, and they're not going to
Then why won't they take your money? That's
Small and insignificant.
sure. Okay.
Now, the other thing to keep in mind, and this is something that really I always try to emphasize when talking about Russia, is that unlike Western Europe, Russia did not emerge as a commercial country. In other words, it never put commercial interests ahead of political interests.
Sure.
So they will take, everyone likes money, but they will take a monetary loss for an ideological position or for a political control.
Sure.
You're not going to seduce them by saying, well, you'll get a little bit more money. And if they feel that threatens something bigger, they will forego that. Mm-hmm. I mean, what's our $10 million a year? It's pennies.
I'll take it.
Yeah. One half a penny of oil or a quarter of a penny, and they will make up multiples of that. So it's pretty insignificant stuff. But they couldn't, if their ideology is, and it unfortunately is, that the U.S. is an enemy number one. If every TV show, virtually every news show, presents the U.S. in a negative light, how can you then justify having a U.S.-Russia foundation operating on its territory?
Right.
They contradict each other. We oftentimes joke that if we were named something else, the Joe Blow Foundation, they wouldn't pay any attention to us because it didn't really mean anything. But because we were the U.S.-Russia Foundation, because our roots were in sort of going back to the 90s and USAID and the Freedom Support Act, we were an anomaly. We were something that was no longer tolerated, I think, in the country.
Right.
So it's not what we did so much as what we stood for and our name that really was at the heart of it.
Well, made you an easy target, I imagine.
Pardon?
It made you an easy target, at least.
Absolutely. And it kind of satisfied the bureaucrats who wanted to get rid of all kinds of American influence.
Right.
They, of course, made it seem as though we were dangerous, that we would start another colored revolution, which of course is nonsense. Now, we were the victims of a hacking job.
Oh, really?
Well before the DNC. In 2012, our emails, about 150 pages worth of private emails, were put up on the internet with translation into Russian. And I may add very good translation. So if we had a typo, they would know what the right word was. I mean, it was done quite well. And so I had the privilege of reading my own emails on the internet in very elegant Russian. For example, I wrote, one of my board members asked me to write to Senator Lugar's staff because they were coming to Moscow and to show them around and take them to dinner.
Sure.
It made it sound in the context that I was about to conspire with Senator Lugar to, bring about major change in Russia. And so that's the kind of stuff that we were first subjected to. And then that in turn was used against us.
Right.
You see, they are really, and so that's how it went.
Yeah, I mean, the most innocuous email can sound awful in the wrong
It can sound very
context.
bad.
Our professor Neuburger was emailing about a student getting a government grant, and it was through his professional email. His company got hacked, and our emails are out on WikiLeaks, and her saying, like, no, we can get money for you, I promise. Like, I know these guys. It looks like she's going to break someone's legs.
Oh, well, it can be very, very, very much misquoted, misused, taken out of context. Very easy to do.
When you see that kind of stuff going on, I mean, do you see America playing any role in a future Russian transition when they've just had 2 decades of saying we're trying to subvert them?
I don't see the U.S. Playing any role, particularly because we inevitably on the side of Ukraine, we're on the side of Georgia, we're on the side of the Baltic states, entities that they, for various reasons, see as either hostile or they would like to take over. No, I think the relationship with Russia is going to be a very limited one to specific issues. There's space, there's terrorism, there's nuclear weapons, there's the Arctic. I mean, there are going to be very discrete issues that or communicable diseases or whatever, something that crosses borders that will need to be dealt with. Sure. And if we're smart, we will deal with Russia on that specific topic and that topic alone. I don't think there's going to be, at least I can't see any kind of warming to it. It could be a perfectly correct relationship. Doesn't have to be a hostile one necessarily,
Right.
but a correct one, I think is fine.
But sweeping cooperation does not seem likely.
No, I don't think so. And a lot depends on what happens in Ukraine, in Georgia.
Right.
If we can help Ukraine become a more stable country, it will be good for us, but it will strain.
Right.
Because Russia's whole philosophy or its approach is to weaken, not necessarily take over Ukraine, but make sure it's a failed state. The more it can be a failed state, the better, because then they can point to Ukraine and say, you don't want to be like them. You want to be like us. We're stable. We're calm. We do things the way they should be done. Look at what's happening next door. On the contrary, if Ukraine were to go and become relatively successful, it would be an example for what the Russians could do.
Right.
So those are the key, I think, issues.
And that's horribly complicated by Crimea, which is pointing to this failed state, but also they just removed a huge voter bloc for elections in a month. So,
well, it's interesting to see how Crimea is going to play out in Russian politics, because I think initially there was an outburst. I was in the country. I was living in the country. People who I thought were relatively reasonable people were saying very ecstatically unreasonable things. I mean, I was surprised by the kind of patriotism / almost in-your-face anger against, this is our prerogative, this is our right. I explained to one very thoughtful Russian who asked me, why is the U.S. against, Russia taking over Crimea? And I explained to him that the U.S. is neither for nor against. The U.S. is for process. If you had set up a process, I said, the way Czechoslovakia set up a process to split that took well over a year, if not 2 years, where you negotiated issues, where you had open and free elections, if that process had been started and had been done with international involvement and observers, and that process took a year and a half, and you figured out who owned what and what needed to be returned and how the split would happen, so the U.S. couldn't care less whether Crimea is in Ukraine or it's in Russia or it's set independent. What the U.S. cares about, what any Western country would care about, is process, because that ensures a legality, that ensures a stability, that ensures a predictability.
Right. Taking
over with the green men and then lying about it for a few days does not instill confidence in anything. He accepted that. He said, he had never thought of it. And I explained to him that Americans in particular are very process-oriented. For us, the number one thing to establish is a process.
Right.
Because the belief is that process will bring us to a reasonable result. If you don't have process, then the loudest person screaming tries to win the day.
Right.
And so I think, and in the Russian political context, those kinds of things are very European, very Western, not necessarily ones that they naturally would go toward.
Right. So that's why something like the EU is so frightening to them. Someone tried to initiate these processes, but that's kind of just not how they do things.
It's a different mental framework to dealing with problems. If you're an authoritarian state, you go to the father figure to solve your problem.
Yeah.
If you're a democracy, you inevitably have to deal with a process. What is legislation? What is Congress? It's a process. It's a way of adjudicating. It's a way of and then you have all the appeal process in court. It's all very process-oriented society. Russia's not a process-oriented society.
Sure.
And I think that's where a lot of the issues, where just Russians and Americans or Russians and Europeans go past each other.
Miles away. And so, I mean, by the tenor of your thoughts, you don't see reforms like this happening under Putin, because that's where he gets his strength, right?
There's no reason for him to do anything other than continue on his path. And of course, the idea is that when an authoritarian figure is in power, he's either in power or in jail. I mean, there's very little in between. Now, you could transition the way Yeltsin did, which was an agreement that he would relinquish given his health, and he and his family would not be prosecuted. That's the way authoritarian regimes also end. Conceivably, if Putin stays there long enough and gets to a point in his life where he feels, for health reasons or whatever other reasons, he could negotiate a transition out. My Russian friends tell me that the transition is going to be to a role above president, kind of father of the nation kind of role.
Gotcha.
And that a president would be someone from within that circle, but he would be for life in this kind of, should Belarus and Russia come together, as some have speculated.
Well, now they're buddies again, right?
Then you could have someone over both as a kind of supreme leader. Maybe that's the right term.
I think they've done that before.
And then you would have, presidents of perspective. But short of that, it would be a negotiated, some kind of, agreement that he could go to Sochi and live his life in Sochi, and nobody would.
So there's a chance he joins like Gorbachev and Dacha the rest of his life, or?
Well, Gorbachev has actually done quite well considering how hated he is in the country. He's managed to have his little foundation and be quite active. He's 89 or 90,
right.
I believe.
Yeah.
But he's also seen as a loser, and as a very negative figure in Russian history. Putin wants to go down as a positive, major, important figure. And so I'm sure there are people in the Kremlin thinking this out, what to do in 2024.
Right.
What to transition to what. There was a recent article by Mr. Surkov, who was the man who supposedly coined the term managed democracy or sovereign democracy. And very cynical article. We don't care about democracy. We are up front. The West is hypocritical. They pretend to have elections. We don't even pretend. We know they're not elections. Very curious piece. But I think he and others are going to be maneuvering for some kind of proper role for this kind of figure to remain for at least for as long as he can.
Yeah, I think it was Erdogan who said, like, democracy is a bus and I'll get off whenever I pull the lever or something along those lines.
So we'll see how that develops. But I think that's kind of where I see it going.
Sure. Well, thank you. You've been very generous with your time. I usually ask people at the end, you mentioned Surkov, what is sort of your last favorite thing that you've read, that you've seen, that you watched? It could be related to Russia. It could be a movie. Just maybe further reading for the audience. Or
well, if it's in Russian, let me think. Well, the Surkov piece is worth reading, not because I think he's necessarily a clairvoyant political thinker, because I think he's throwing into the mix what people are certainly contemplating and sort of seeing how it plays out. But I would suggest something a little bit different. I would say if you want to understand today's Russia, study Russian history.
Sure. And
I think that probably a figure like Stalin, why has Stalin come back? Yesterday or day before was his birthday. People were placing flowers on his grave.
It's the day of his death, March 5th, the day of his death.
Yeah. Something that wouldn't have necessarily happened in the Soviet period.
Right.
Soviets were very careful not to bring stuff. Why is he brought back? What is that saying about today's Russia? When I was living in Russia, I went to one of the May Day parades, and I saw people carrying icons of Stalin. I was so disgusted I went home. I just couldn't stand it. But I saw it personally. I saw it with my own eyes. I mean, somebody who equals, if not exceeds, Hitler in terms of atrocities committed.
Sure.
No Russian family is without someone who suffered. And yet, why is he back? What does that tell us about the country? And I think read Steve Kotkin's biography of Stalin was one place. Very, very useful, I think, for understanding today's Russia. Look at figures like Alexander III and Nicholas I. Why is Putin bringing them back in some way? What is that saying about today's Russia? I think would be very interesting.
Yeah.
Read conservative Russian thinkers. They're much more important than the liberals.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much. This has been great.
My pleasure.